Welcome to the history section.
Today we're going to be examining the social and administrative structures of old Japan under feudal rule.
Specifically, we're looking at something of a contradiction.
A very interesting one.
Yeah.
It's this unique coexistence of a government that was, on the one hand, highly aristocratic, but on the other, had features that fostered what some have called an ideal democracy.
Right. And the research reveals this profound historical paradox. When you look at many Western civilizations, the benefits of, wealth, learning, civic life.
They were restricted.
Exactly. Restricted to a few favored classes. The common people were often left impoverished, disenfranchised. But here, in feudal Japan, the social state seems to have been deliberately well-engineered.
Engineered to do what, specifically?
To ensure that those foundational benefits were widely shared among the masses.
Which suggests a very unique and sustained focus from the administration on the welfare of the common person.
And the result seems to have been widespread self-respect, even contentment within the general population, which is just not what you'd expect from a feudal system.
To really understand how this system came to be, we have to establish the context, the constraints, really.
Geographically and chronologically.
Precisely. So we go back to the early 17th century. The Japanese government makes a monumental decision. It implements a policy of national seclusion.
Cutting itself off from almost the entire world.
Almost entirely. And this self-imposed isolation, it immediately creates an administrative challenge of staggering proportions.
Which is?
How to supply a large and rapidly multiplying population that's now confined entirely within this relatively small island group.
And the geographical constraint was absolute, wasn't it? There was no alternative.
None. The population had to subsist solely on what could be produced at home. Exchange with other lands was almost zero, and emigration was completely prohibited.
And when you look at the actual usable land, it's a tiny fraction of the whole.
A tiny fraction. We're talking about only 1/12 of the entire land area being available for cultivation.
1/12.
Yeah?
That puts an existential pressure on agriculture.
It does. On productivity, on resource management, all within this completely closed system.
And then you have another factor that makes the problem even worse. Or better, depending on how you look at it.
You're talking about the peace.
The 2.5 centuries of profound peace. It's great for development, of course, but it removes the usual checks on population growth.
The Malthusian checks, exactly. We have no population reduction from constant war waste, from border conflicts, from invasions, which were all typical of feudal eras everywhere else.
So the population just keeps growing.
It keeps growing.
Yeah.
And that fundamental necessity survival under these extreme conditions of resource scarcity and continuous growth, that provided the secret.
The secret to Japan's peculiar democracy.
It's the engine behind it. National survival absolutely mandated organized national welfare, and above all else, maximum agricultural output.
So this urgent need for productivity, it drives a deliberate, really fundamental structural change in the social hierarchy.
And it all centers on one group.
The agricultural class, the Byakusho.
Yes, the farmer was elevated, radically elevated in status.
So cultivating the soil wasn't just a menial task.
Far from it. It was raised to the dignity of a critical profession. The practice of farming was often treated almost as a fine art.
Especially in certain areas, right?
Especially in the provinces that were under the direct control of the shogunate. That's where administrative supervision was most rigorous and where this ideal was most actively promoted.
And administratively, this was formalized. It wasn't just a nice idea.
Oh, no. It was embedded in the social ranking system. The farmer was formally ranked second.
Second only to the samurai.
Which underscores their absolute critical importance to the entire national enterprise. And the government's efforts went way beyond just economic support.
You were trying to cultivate something more.
They were actively seeking to cultivate the farmers' self-respect, their independence, their sense of individuality. The goal was to instill a kind of moral and civic pride in the most vital economic sector.
To ensure their maximum commitment to the land.
Exactly.
And in sharp contrast to this, you have the merchant class.
The mere trader.
And they were deliberately ranked below the farmer.
Which, again, speaks volumes about the priorities of the state under seclusion. This policy essentially created an economic firewall.
Protecting primary production.
Yes. Farmers were generally prohibited from becoming merchants without explicit government consent. To do so was seen as a degradation of their status.
So the state prioritized subsistence, stability over what it probably saw as speculative commercial wealth.
Precisely. And this deliberate fostering of self-respect among the farming population, It correlates directly with the formation of these highly organized village communities.
Communities that operated with, well, remarkable democratic independence, at least in their municipal affairs.
Right, so while the authority of the central government was, in theory, absolute and overarching,
Its iron hand, as it's been called, was rarely felt.
or needed, at least not at the local level for day-to-day governance.
Yeah.
History tells us that the laws these people lived under were unique in their origin. They largely came up from the people.
Rather than being imposed down upon them.
Exactly. Any local custom or rule that had been around for 50 years or more was respected and automatically recognized as statutory law.
Which embeds communal practice directly into the legal structure.
It does. And this decentralized legal mechanism, it provided a deep and genuine basis for the farmers' consciousness that they were fundamentally self-governed.
Under their own rules, their own traditions.
And the research suggests that the stimulus this gave to the democratic spirit resulted in a population that was profoundly familiar with their civic rights and duties.
It's been argued that there was likely no other country where the masses, right down to the smallest landholder, were more familiar with the specifics of their rights.
And their responsibilities. And the high esteem they were held in, this emboldened them. It gave them the confidence to assert and defend those rights against any local overreach.
And the strength of that conviction, that willingness to assert their rights, even at a tremendous personal cost. There's a very dramatic historical example of this.
You're referring to Sogoro.
The ghost of Sakura, as he's often remembered.
He was an Anushi, a village chief, and he became acutely aware of the deep suffering and injustice being inflicted on his villagers.
Probably due to local corruption or maybe excessive tax demands from a regional lord.
Likely, yes. And he knew the penalty for what he was about to do. Direct appeal to the shogun was strictly forbidden.
But he did it anyway. He made the long, arduous journey to the capital.
It was an extraordinary act of self-sacrifice. He actually intercepted the shogun's litter.
A direct, shocking transgression of protocol. Protocol that maintained that necessary distance between the ruler and the ruled.
And he presented a written petition detailing all the grievances. His whole calculation was predicated on one idea.
That the shogunate's core commitment to the welfare of the producing class, the foundation of the nation, would outweigh the crime of breaking protocol.
And the outcome. It really encapsulates the contradiction inherent in this whole system.
The petition was heated.
It was. The wrongs afflicting the villagers were investigated, and they were righted. But Sogoro himself,
He and his entire family were put to death.
for the transgression. The system could tolerate exposing local corruption, but it could not tolerate the destabilizing precedent of a commoner bypassing the entire aristocratic hierarchy.
So, paradoxically, the story is cited as evidence that the high social rank given to farmers worked. It imbued them with that sense of self-sacrifice, that devotion to community that was characteristic of the samurai.
Prompting them to risk everything for the welfare of the group.
Let's shift our focus a bit now to taxation, because the perspective on taxation that developed here was, well, it was highly unusual.
It was completely divorced from the view that was common in, say, medieval Europe.
Right. Taxes were not seen as a burden, not an imposition, and critically, not a form of robbery.
Instead, they were regarded as a loyal duty, and even more strikingly, as an offering. The term used is mitsugimano,
Which means exactly that, a precious contribution.
a precious thing made by the devoted subject to the Lord. And this cultural framing, it completely transformed the act of paying taxes into a kind of communal right.
So the collection of the annual tax rice wasn't a dreaded bureaucratic chore.
No, it was treated more like a significant social occasion. Sometimes it even resembled a regional fair. You'd have farmers arriving at the collector storehouses and actually competing with one another.
Competing how?
Meticulously vying to present the best quality rice, the cleanest, the purest rice for the official inspection.
So the social pressure is key here. It wasn't the collector demanding quality so much as the farmer offering excellence.
That's it. And the sources note that it was a genuine source of deep mortification, of shame, for a farmer if his rice was rejected.
Or deemed improperly cleaned for the Lord's use.
This tax rice was seen as a precious commodity, something pure, not to be defiled. It symbolized the purity of their loyal duty.
And there's a wonderful anecdote that captures the depth of this reference.
The one about the third shogun, Tokugawa Iemitsu.
That's the one. He was traveling incognito, stopped at a farmer's house.
And he inadvertently sat down on some prepared bags of rice that was waiting to be taken to the collector's storehouse.
And the farmer, who had no idea who this powerful man was, immediately and angrily ordered him off.
The farmer's reasoning was that the rice belonged to the Lord, and regardless of who the man was, it could not be treated disrespectfully, it couldn't be contaminated by being sat upon.
And the result of that encounter says so much about the values the regime wanted to cultivate.
It does. The great chief, upon realizing the depth of this poor farmer's loyalty to his lord, his dedication to the purity of the tax offering.
He didn't reward him with money.
No. He rewarded him by calling the farmer to a place in his direct service. It reflects this dynamic where devotion, honesty, and civic virtue shown by a subject were admired and ultimately uplifted by the ruling class.
Reinforcing the status of the cultivator.
And if you connect this whole framing of taxation back to the broader picture, this seemingly cordial, even affectionate relationship between the government and the people.
It resulted in a peasantry whose condition was, by all accounts, profoundly superior to that of the masses in medieval Europe.
Absolutely. Regardless of whether the rulers' motives were purely self-interested, and they probably were, I mean, they needed to secure maximum revenue from a stable population. The resulting system fostered virtues.
Cheerfulness, contentment, self-respect.
And crucially, it largely avoided that endemic system of plunder, of rapine, of violent oppression that European serfs and vassals faced, where the produce was often seized, not offered.
So let's move to the structural mechanism of the village itself, village autonomy. This is where the resemblance to truly democratic forms is, well, it's startling.
It is. Despite existing within this intensely aristocratic Oriental state, the village communities had almost complete local self-government.
At least in managing their municipal affairs.
Yes. The comparison has been drawn directly to the germ of American democracy found in the New England town meetings. Feudal Japan, in strict national seclusion, seems to have worked out an almost identical solution to the problem of local governance.
And the key to this was that local finance was entirely under the control of the community itself.
Completely insulated from central government interference. The process would begin with the local officers, the nanushi, who was the mayor, the kumigashira, heads of companies, and the toshiori, the patriarchs.
And they would draft an estimate of necessary local expenses.
The village budget, essentially, covering everything from maintaining irrigation systems to local security.
And this budget estimate, it was governed by 4 explicit guiding principles. They were written right at the head of the document.
A kind of declaration of local rights.
It was. The first principle stated that any unreasonable acts that officers wished to carry out without the explicit consent of the farmers were strictly forbidden.
So accountability for the local elite, right from the start.
The second principle demanded transparency. Nothing proposed by the nanushi for purely selfish purposes could be enacted without the express public consent of the farmers.
And the third mandated fiscal prudence. Economy must be strictly observed in the use of village money.
And those 2 points together ensured that the community's resources, which were so precious, weren't squandered on elite interests.
Then there's the fourth principle, which ensured finality and local control.
That's right. The estimate, once it was agreed to by all the villagers, signed and sealed by them, was considered final and binding. It formalized the communal decision-making process.
Making it resistant to any last-minute challenges or bureaucratic manipulation. Once the farmers had met, considered every item, and collectively formalized that document, it became valid.
And only then was it presented to the central government's representative, the daikwan.
And this is where the structural genius of the system really lies. The central government's oversight through the daikwan was strictly limited. It was about protection, not control.
So what could he actually do?
He could only examine the estimate and offer advice, maybe recommendations for efficiency. But crucially, he had no power whatsoever to increase the estimate or forbid its adoption.
So his role was inverted from what you'd expect of a feudal tax collector.
Completely. His primary duty was focused solely on ensuring that the nanushi, the local mayor, did not oppress, exploit, or squeeze the people.
And the farmers still had recourse.
Yes, they retained the right to demand an official examination if they had any doubts about how the money was being used. It's a classic check and balance mechanism designed to preserve local autonomy against internal corruption.
That fiscal independence really is the strongest evidence for this claim of an ideal democracy operating within this highly aristocratic state.
And that principle of local democratic control extended right down into the foundational social unit of the village.
The kumi.
The kumi. Literally, the company. It was typically a group of 5 contiguous families.
And the organizing principle was just proximity.
Purely physical contiguity of residence. Not wealth, Not social standing, not profession. They were neighbors, plain and simple.
Which must have had a profound leveling effect.
It did. A powerful democratic leveling effect, constantly undercutting the rigid aristocratic structure that surrounded it. Because of this mandate of physical closeness, you had constant mixing of status.
So a rich farmer with extensive lands might be in the same kumi as his poorest tenant.
Exactly. Or the village official, the nanushi, might be paired with the most humble mechanic or tradesman.
This structure created some extraordinary social contradictions.
It did. On one hand, you have this unapproachable aristocracy, steeped in strict class pride and rigid etiquette that dictated every single social interaction.
But on the other hand, the foundational unit of community life, the kumi, fosters a complete obliteration of those social distinctions within its immediate operations.
Establishing a spirit of, well, apparent good fellowship that pervaded all ranks, a spirit that was required for everyone to cooperate and survive.
And we see evidence of this forced intimacy even at the highest levels of society.
Yes, the custom where an imperial master of ceremonies, a figure of significant nobility, would invite every single servant, down to the most humble, to his house on New Year's Day.
And in that festive gathering, the noble host wouldn't just preside.
No, he would actively join in. He'd play the often silly sports and games, sometimes paying forfeits that involved deliberate physical acts of social leveling.
Like having his face smeared with ink, the marks of defeat.
Precisely.
But the core inanity of the kumi wasn't really about rights, was it?
No, and that's a crucial distinction. It wasn't defined by the assertion of individual rights, which is what characterizes many Western democracies. It was defined by the assumption of collective duties and mutual responsibilities.
So each kumi head transacted the general business, but the group as a whole also exercised social supervision over the private affairs of its members.
And that structure was fundamentally preventative. It would often intervene to stop shiftless or extravagant members from incurring liabilities or debt.
Because that debt could compromise the financial and social stability of the entire group.
Exactly. Let's elaborate on that communal responsibility because it's really the engine of the whole kumi system.
The kumi as a body was explicitly responsible for everything.
Everything. The defaults and the evil doing of all of its members. That includes their families and their servants.
So if one family was careless in its farm work, or if a member committed an offense,
The other four families shared the full financial and social responsibility for it.
which must have instilled a great deal of dignity and kindliness into each member.
It had to. Every individual felt themselves entrusted not just with their own welfare, but with the fidelity and success of four other neighboring families.
And this collective responsibility, it created a powerful impulse for organized mutual service that went far beyond just the immediate five families.
It did. And it's this extensive, decentralized system of neighborhood aid that effectively replaced the institutions we rely on in the West today.
Things like insurance companies, savings banks, hospitals.
Organized charities, all of it. The intrinsic kindness, the systematic kindliness that was embedded in the kumi, it became this enduring, self-regulating feature of the society.
Ensuring that no member fell completely through the cracks.
And you can still see surviving evidence of this intense geographic community structure today, even in a huge metropolis like Tokyo.
How so?
If you observe certain general illuminations or processions, you can notice that the lantern designs will abruptly change at specific points.
Marking the old village boundaries.
Exactly. They're marking the limits of the ancient, distinct villages that the city is now an aggregate of. And these communities, they retain their distinct consciousness. They still have their unique old-time festivals, the Matsuris.
It underscores that pervasive and strong sense of neighborliness that endures, anchored by those original geographical lines.
And the strength of this community bond in the rural districts, where it was most essential for survival, is really quite profound.
There's that one anecdote about the village known for its cloisonné ware.
A highly refined, delicate, and time-consuming art. Suddenly, all the work at the chief workshop just ceased.
Why?
Because the season for rice planting had been unusually late that year. And so all hands, including the highly skilled artisans who normally handle delicate enameling, had turned out.
To help their neighbors with the late, coarse, filthy labor of rice planting.
The willingness to just abandon that delicate, profitable work for strenuous communal necessity, it demonstrates the immense strength of the community bond over individual economic specialization.
And this aid wasn't just based on goodwill. There were codified provisions for common calamities.
In the case of a fire loss, for example, neighbors would immediately join in to reestablish the home and replenish the stock of the unfortunate family.
And because of the simplicity of living that was enforced by regulation, rebuilding was a comparatively easy matter. It relied on communal labor, not complex financial schemes.
There were also detailed, proportional provisions for supporting foundlings or for burying strangers found dead within the community's boundaries.
How is that assessed?
For a foundling, the financial responsibility was shared equitably based on proximity and role. 3/10 of the cost in money from the house owner who found the child, 2/10 from his immediate kumi in money or labor, and the remaining 5/10 from the other wardmen, the other house owners, again in money or labor.
And the same for burying a stranger.
The exact same proportions. It guaranteed dignity in death and support in life, funded by this precise, geographically based collective insurance model.
Even the costs associated with external legal action were subject to this communal responsibility.
Yes, in cases where a poor man was involved in litigation in another jurisdiction, his travel expenses, court fees, all the other burdens were shared by the community.
And this idea of sharing legal costs brings us to another critical cultural characteristic of this system.
The intense repugnance to litigation. It was avoided whenever possible.
And that sentiment grows from the same root as traditional Japanese politeness.
It does. It's that inherent desire to smooth over life's sharp, disruptive points, to preserve tranquility and agreeable existence within the community.
Litigation was seen as an act that introduced conflict, disharmony.
It threatened the communal spirit that was built on mutual duty. So because of this cultural bias, the early village communities functioned as self-contained courts of arbitration.
So minor disagreements between kumi members were typically settled by the 5 heads of families meeting privately.
And, crucially, conducting these meetings over moderate amounts of food and wine. They consciously believed that having a shared meal and light drinking tended to promote good feeling.
And made a settlement easier. A friendly spirit was more likely to exist under those circumstances than in a cold, formal court.
Exactly. And if that arbitration failed, or if an offense was repeated, the neighbors would resort to powerful non-court sanctions.
Such as?
Usually, systematically breaking off social intercourse with the offender, refusing to recognize them socially or interact with them unless absolutely necessary.
And that social isolation, in a society built entirely on mutual duty and community belonging, must have been a powerful sanction.
It generally brought the offender to terms far more quickly than any external coercion from higher authorities could have.
So a case that actually reached the higher courts was considered deeply disreputable.
It was. It suggested that the person seeking the courts was trying to gain some kind of undue advantage, maybe through trickery, appealing to an external, impersonal system rather than relying on community mediation.
And there was a real social cost to being seen as litigious.
A concrete and tangible one. Families known to use the courts were studiously avoided when it came time to arrange marriages for their children. They were viewed as volatile or disruptive.
And there was an economic consequence as well.
Yes, it was an observable fact that districts where people frequently resorted to courts were generally poor as a result. They lost valuable time and necessary money in prolonged legal proceedings.
So the system incentivized internal resolution, prioritizing social stability and productivity over the abstract assertion of individual legal rights.
And this philosophy of communal priority, it leads us to the surprising principle of economic equity that prevailed. It actively managed the relationship between wealth and poverty.
The research states that in this island empire, the rich appeared to live for the sake of the poor.
A clear inversion of the common Western experience, where the poor often struggle to sustain the wealth of the few.
And this principle showed up clearly in the pricing system, in commerce.
It did. Buying in small quantities, which was direct evidence of lack of means, entitled the purchaser to the utmost consideration and the largest possible discount.
But conversely, if you showed overt evidence of wealth, of an ability to pay,
prices were significantly advanced.
And this differential pricing wasn't seen as extortion.
No, it was viewed as an equitable mode of taxation. By charging the wealthy more, the system ensured that the same goods could be offered to the poor at the lowest possible rates.
Essentially using private commerce as a mechanism for income redistribution to stabilize the common population.
And the specific examples of this taxation by status are particularly illuminating.
At tea houses or taverns, for instance.
The nominal rates for basic entertainment and board were kept low for everyone, guaranteeing access for the poorest. But wealthy guests were strongly expected, almost obligated, to leave chaudai,
Tea money.
proportional to their presumed or known ability to pay. And these substantial gifts functioned directly to subsidize the cheap housing and feeding of the poor, maintaining those low nominal rates for everybody.
And then there's the famous example of using transportation when shopping.
Yes, if you walked to a shop on foot, demonstrating modesty and lack of means, you were charged one price.
If you arrived in a jinrikisha, indicating a higher status, you paid more.
And if you drove up in a carriage, the rates for all articles were correspondingly advanced. It was a sliding scale based on perceived wealth.
Foreigners, I imagine, were often at the top of that scale.
They were. Often seen as walking mines of wealth, they were frequently subjected to the highest rates. Not out of xenophobia, but because they were considered lawful subjects for this ancient system of equitable taxation.
A system designed for the benefit of the community's neediest members.
And beyond just consumer pricing, the government instituted serious land law safeguards, specifically designed to protect the small landholder.
The foundation of the state.
Exactly. The laws actively discouraged the ownership of large tracts, especially by non-residents, and they made it nearly impossible for small owners to sell their inherited holdings.
Guarding the poor against becoming dependent on great landed proprietors, who might accumulate vast estates and drive up tenancy rates.
The penalties for violating these foundational land laws were severe.
What would happen?
If a farm was illegally sold, the seller faced imprisonment or even banishment. The buyer was fined, and the land was confiscated, returned to community or government hands.
So everyone involved was punished.
Everyone. If there was a witness of the transaction, they were fined. And the village mayor, the Nanushi, was ordered to resign his office for failing in his primary duty to prevent the sale.
And in the relationship between an employer and an employee, or a landlord and a tenant,
the interests of the latter were always made paramount. The priority was always given to the producer over the proprietor.
For instance, in the case of a partial crop failure.
If the harvest was only enough to support the physical sustenance of the laborer could legally claim the entire crop for their support.
Leaving nothing for the employer or landowner.
Nothing. Survival of the worker came first. In times of regional hardship, landowners were legally required to loan their surplus grain from good years to the tillers of the land.
To be made up when conditions improved?
Yes, and significant rent rebates were routinely provided. Eviction was almost unheard of, largely due to intense public opprobrium. The universal presumption was that no tenant would refuse to pay rent unless they were absolutely unable to do so.
The system was built around necessity, not contract law.
And most remarkably, law executors were generally instructed that the fundamental principle in any conflict between the rich and the poor was to give the latter the full benefit of the doubt.
An administrative bias against concentrated wealth.
Designed to ensure the economic structure remained stable, protecting the productive base of the isolated nation.
So it's clear the government established this comprehensive mechanism for protection and economic equity. But this entire system of local self-government, of communal freedom, it existed side by side with something that seems completely contradictory.
The final pillar of the feudal structure, an extensive and rigid system of paternalism and strict economy.
Enforced through minute sumptuary laws.
And this tension between democratic local autonomy and a pervasive central despotism is one of the most fascinating contradictions in Japanese social life.
So in this local system that was, in many ways, idyllic.
There ruled a despotism that meticulously reached into every corner of every home. While the villagers were independent in their municipal administration, their domestic concerns, their personal consumption, were relentlessly regulated.
And these sumptuary laws regulated almost every item of household and personal economy, based on one's
bungen, station in life.
And this concept of bungen is key. It was a fixed, legally defined station.
And it determined precisely what you were allowed to consume, possess, or display. The goal wasn't just social control, it was the highly rationalized enforcement of frugality across the entire populace.
Driven by that foundational necessity of maximizing resource efficiency in a closed, growing population.
If you spent money on luxuries, you risked the stability of the group.
And the specificity of these rules is, well, it's genuinely staggering. It shows an extraordinary level of government intrusion.
Let's take the regulations for a farmer of 100 koku. This is a middle to upper tier income earner.
What were the rules for his house?
His house could be no longer than 10 ken, which is about 60 feet. And crucially, there could be no parlor, no zashiki.
A room dedicated solely to receiving guests, a sign of social display.
Exactly. And a tiled roof, a sign of expense and permanence, required special government permission. It was typically only granted for fire safety.
And what about ceremonial expenditures? Things like marriage gifts.
They were ruthlessly precise to prevent competitive spending and aspirational debt. The household could only provide 2 nagamochi, chests for bedclothes, 1 tansu, a chest of drawers, 1 tsuzora, and 1 hasamibako.
Extremely specific.
And the ceremonial presents themselves were restricted to symbolic necessities: the ceremonial sash, a single fan, 1 wine vessel, and limited specific amounts of dried fish, seaweed, and ceremonial fish.
Even the food at the wedding was prescribed.
Strictly. Limited to specific types of soup, only 2 dishes on the small ceremonial table, and the cakes and liquids given to guests to take home had to be in extremely restricted small sizes.
This detailed control prevented any precedent for extravagant public display from ever being set.
And further, the laws strictly prohibited the family from ever wearing silk clothes, a costly item of conspicuous consumption.
And what if a son or daughter married into a family whose station did permit silk?
Then the householder was explicitly required to request that the marrying partner adhere to the no silk rule during the wedding ceremony itself,
Ensuring the lower station's frugality wasn't undermined, even on the most significant social occasion.
There were rules for everything: the number of guests allowed, the prohibition of using lacquer boxes for gifts, strict rules against offering wine during visits of condolence, anything where emotion or social obligation might tempt excessive spending.
Now let's consider the regulations for a common farm laborer, the lowest functional level.
Their house size was constrained to 5.5 ken, about 32 feet. The roof had to be straw or bamboo thatch, only the cheapest, most accessible local materials.
And wedding gifts.
Even more severely minimalist, limited to 1 tsuzura. The longer, more expensive chest, the nagamochi, was explicitly forbidden. At entertainments, only 1 flat dish and 1 soup could be offered.
Served in simpler bowls, not proper cups.
And while small silk ornamentation was permitted on collars, sleeves, and belts, a small concession to basic self-respect, it was strictly forbidden to wear silk in public.
Even their footwear was regulated with minute detail.
Limited to the simplest nerzuri sandals. The more costly iron and leather seta were prohibited. Men had to wear bamboo thong sandals on all occasions. Women were only allowed cotton thongs on strictly ceremonial occasions.
It's an extraordinary systemic level of control over every facet of domestic life, all rooted in that philosophy of necessary efficiency.
And the lawgivers themselves, they provided a clear administrative justification for this deeply invasive system.
What was their reasoning?
They stated that the rules were not designed to oppress or force false intimacy. They existed because, without such strict legally enforced regulations, families were very likely to be unable to live upon their means, and thus would come to grief.
So the ultimate stated objective of the entire system was to enforce pervasive frugality and economic stability.
To prevent social aspiration from compromising the national food base.
And this highly regulated system was underpinned by a structure they called the natural law of the social organization.
The kami bakusho, the upper farmers, were explicitly instructed that they must treat the shimo byakusho, the lower farmers and laborers, kindly, and the shimo, in turn, must respect the kami.
This legally enforced hierarchy, combined with strict consumption regulation, was intended to keep the entire community orderly, peaceful, and productive.
Actively discouraging any social ambition that might lead to individual or collective poverty.
So if we review the overall result of these complex, often contradictory feudal policies, the exaltation of the farmer, the local democracy, the mutual aid of the kumi, and this rigid paternalism,
we can conclude that the fundamental problem, that population and subsistence crisis, was successfully managed. The profound agricultural development, stimulated by the pride and respect instilled in the farmer class, ensured that the limited arable land was more than sufficient.
sufficient to support the teeming, isolated population that grew so dramatically during those 2.5 centuries of peace.
And the lasting social impact of this era is profound. It's enduring. The pinching economies, the exhaustive sumptuary laws, they became not just the letter of the law, but ingrained custom.
Even influencing the consumption patterns of the higher ranks of society.
And this ultimately resulted in a remarkable simplicity of living, a consequent freedom from superfluous cares and aspirational debt. It made the Japanese population, in the best sense of the word, independent and content within their station.
This complex blend of rigid hierarchy, profound local autonomy, and aggressive economic equity, all enforced by an all-reaching paternalism. It reveals a unique historical solution.
A solution to the existential challenges of resource management under seclusion, resulting in a civilization where community welfare and production efficiency were the paramount administrative concerns.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed learning something new. That's all for now, but in case you didn't notice, there are a lot more episodes on this subject available on this channel. If you're enjoying these historical podcasts, please like and subscribe and share with other history buffs.
While this is an AI recording, the research that has gone into this production is comprehensive and focuses on very specific moments in history, designed to bring as much detail to the listener as possible. Thanks again for listening in.